Sometimes life surprises you in the most ordinary moments. One warm afternoon, something happened in my backyard that I never saw coming. It began as just another quiet day, a garden hose in my hand, sunlight brushing over the leaves, and the faint hum of summer air. But what unfolded left me thinking about it for days. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know, from which city are you watching this? I love hearing where everyone's tuning in from. And if you enjoy real-life stories that make you stop and think for a moment, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like. It really helps more people find these stories, and maybe, just maybe, it'll remind someone that the most unexpected moments can change how we see ourselves and others. I had been tending to my little garden that afternoon, lost in my thoughts. The roses near the fence had finally started to bloom, their pink petals shimmering like soft velvet in the sun. I took pride in those flowers. My late husband used to joke that I talked to them more than I talked to people. Maybe he was right. Since he passed, the garden had become my quiet companion. The sound of water trickling over the soil gave me a sense of peace, something steady in a world that kept moving without him. As I leaned down to adjust the hose, I noticed movement beyond the fence. It was Michael, my neighbor's son. He must have been around 23 or 24, tall with an easy smile that always seemed a little shy. He'd moved back home a few months ago after finishing college, helping his parents with repairs and their small landscaping business. Sometimes, when he passed by, he'd wave or offer to carry heavy bags of soil from my car. He was polite, thoughtful, and had this gentle way about him. Something rare these days. That day, he was standing near the fence with a spade in his hand, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Afternoon, Mrs. Lane," he called out. His voice was steady but had a boyish warmth to it. "Hello, Michael," I replied, smiling. "Working hard, I see." He laughed softly. "Trying to, but the heat's got other plans for me." I chuckled, turning off the hose for a moment. "Would you like some lemonade? I made a pitcher earlier. You look like you could use a break." He hesitated at first, then nodded. "Sure, I'd like that. Thanks." I poured him a glass over ice and handed it across the fence. He took it carefully, our fingers brushing for a second. It was nothing, just an innocent touch, but something about it made the air feel heavier, thicker somehow. He smiled, genuine, grateful, and took a sip. "This is amazing," he said. "Better than anything I could make." "Well, that's because you probably don't add a pinch of love," I teased. He laughed again, and I found myself smiling more than I had in a long time. We chatted for a bit, about the weather, the neighborhood, his plans now that he was back home. He told me he was thinking about starting his own landscaping company. His eyes lit up when he talked about it, full of that youthful fire I remembered once having myself. It was refreshing, really. The way he spoke about life, about possibilities. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten I still had inside me: curiosity. At one point, a light breeze swept across the garden, carrying the scent of jasmine. A few strands of my hair fell forward, and before I could brush them back, Michael reached out gently, hesitating for just a moment, then tucked them behind my ear. My breath caught. His fingers were warm. There was nothing inappropriate in the gesture. It was thoughtful, kind, but something about it sent a ripple through me. He seemed to notice my pause and took a small step back. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I said quietly. "Thank you." We stood there for a moment, both unsure what to say next. The sound of a bird chirping nearby seemed unusually loud. I broke the silence with a soft laugh. You'd think after 50 years I'd be immune to small gestures like that. He looked at me curiously. "Why 50? You look younger." I smiled, shaking my head. "Flattery won't get you more lemonade." He grinned, but there was something earnest in his expression, something that lingered beyond the words. I'm not trying to flatter. You just have this. Low, like someone who still enjoys the world. That made me pause. No one had said anything like that to me in years. I'd been so used to being seen as someone's widow, someone's mother, someone's quiet neighbor. Hearing that made me feel seen, as me. The woman I used to be before life took its turns. We kept talking for a while longer, leaning on opposite sides of the fence, the sun starting to dip lower in the sky. I told him about my late husband, about how we used to garden together. He listened, really listened, the kind of listening that feels like a gift. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. When the first crickets began to sing, he said softly, "You know, Mrs. Lane, you've got one of the most peaceful gardens I've ever seen. It feels alive." I smiled, my throat tightening slightly. That's the goal. It's my way of keeping a little beauty around me. He nodded. You do it well. Then he glanced toward the fence post, hesitating. Would it be okay if I helped you sometime? With the garden, I mean. I could fix that old trellis or trim the hedges. The offer was innocent enough, yet his tone carried something deeper, something almost tender. I could have said no. I could have kept things simple. But instead, I found myself saying, I'd like that very much. He smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and I felt the warmth of it linger even after he turned and walked back toward his yard. I stood there for a while, watching the light fade from the sky, the air cooling around me. Something had shifted that day. Not in a way that scared me, but in a way that reminded me that I was still here, still capable of feeling connection, of being curious, of being alive. As I turned off the garden hose and gathered my tools, I glanced once more at the fence, half expecting to see him there again. The yard was quiet now, but I knew deep down that something had begun, something subtle, unexpected, and perhaps something I wasn't quite ready to name yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, replaying the day over and over. It wasn't what he said that kept echoing in my mind. It was the way he looked at me when he said it. That quiet sincerity. That warmth. I hadn't felt that kind of attention in years, not since before my husband, Robert, passed. It wasn't romantic, at least not in a way that crossed any lines. But it stirred something human, something gentle that I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold. I got up earlier than usual, almost without thinking. I made a pot of coffee, sliced a few lemons, and prepared another pitcher of lemonade. Why, I couldn't quite say. Maybe habit, maybe hope. As I stepped out into the backyard, the morning air felt different, still fresh, but filled with anticipation. The roses had opened even more overnight. Drops of dew clung to their petals, reflecting the light like tiny pieces of glass. I put on my gardening gloves and started trimming the lower stems. The sound of the hedge trimmer from next door soon followed. He was there again. Michael, in a faded blue t-shirt and work shorts, was fixing the wooden fence panel between our yards. He must have started early, too. He saw me and waved with that same easy smile that somehow managed to disarm me. "Morning, Mrs. Lane," he called out. "Morning, Michael," I replied, trying not to sound too cheerful. "You're up early." He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep much. Figured I'd make myself useful." There it was again, that quiet mirroring of my own mood. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. The thought made me feel strangely connected to him, though I quickly brushed it aside and focused on the plants. After a few minutes, he leaned on the fence, hammer still in hand. "Your roses look even better today," he said. "I don't know how you do it." "It's all about consistency," I said with a smile. "You give them attention every day, and they reward you for it." He looked at me for a moment longer than I expected. "Guess that applies to more than just flowers." The words hung between us, gentle but heavy with meaning. I could feel my heartbeat pick up just a little. He wasn't flirting exactly, but there was a quiet depth in his tone, a kind of understanding that transcended the words themselves. I poured him another glass of lemonade, passing it over the fence like before. Our hands brushed again, just barely, but it was enough to send a small pulse of warmth through me. The air was warm already, but I could feel a different kind of heat rising beneath my skin. "Thanks," he said softly. "You really don't have to keep spoiling me like this." "It's just lemonade," I said lightly. "Don't read too much into it." He laughed, that easy, boyish laugh that made him seem both older and younger at the same time. "I'll try not to." For a while, we worked in companionable silence, the kind that feels comfortable, not awkward. Every so often I'd glance his way, watching how focused he was, how easily he moved, how he seemed to belong in the world without forcing it. After an hour or so, he climbed over the short part of the fence to help me realign one of the trellises that had come loose. I protested at first, but he insisted. "It'll just take a minute," he said, flashing a grin. Standing that close to him, I realized how long it had been since I'd shared space with someone who carried such easy energy. He smelled faintly of soap and fresh-cut grass. His hands were rough, steady, reassuring. When he lifted the trellis upright, I held it in place while he tightened the screws. "There," he said finally, stepping back. "Perfect." I smiled. "You make it look effortless." "Maybe it's the company," he said, his voice quieter now. I turned toward him, and for a brief second, our eyes met. There was no awkwardness, no need to look away. Just a shared stillness, two people from different times in their lives, recognizing something familiar in each other. Then, just as naturally, the moment passed. He cleared his throat and went back to adjusting the tools. I felt the corners of my mouth curve upward. It wasn't love, it wasn't infatuation. It was something subtler, a kind of unspoken gratitude between two people who happened to meet in a quiet corner of the world. As the day went on, clouds began to gather. By late afternoon, a light rain started to fall. I stood by the porch, watching the droplets bounce off the leaves, listening to the soft patter against the roof. I thought of him, of that brief look we shared, and when I glanced toward the fence, I saw him too, standing under the small shelter by his shed, looking back at me through the rain. We didn't wave this time. We didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. When the rain finally stopped, I went back outside, the air now cool and heavy with that clean, earthy smell that follows a summer shower. The soil was dark and rich beneath my feet, and there by the fence was something new. A single rose freshly cut, its stem carefully placed through the gap in the wood. My breath caught. I picked it up slowly, feeling the dampness of the petals between my fingers. There was no note, no message, just the quiet offering of something simple and sincere. I stood there for a long time, holding that rose, the rain dripping softly from the leaves above me. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a neighbor, not as a widow, not as a woman defined by her past, but as someone who still had color, warmth, and life left to feel. As the evening light faded, I placed the rose in a small vase on my kitchen table. It glowed faintly in the golden dusk, a quiet reminder that some connections don't need to be explained. They just need to be felt. And that night, when I lay in bed again, I didn't feel restless anymore. The house still felt quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was peaceful, like the gentle calm that comes after a summer rain, when everything smells new again, and you realize, maybe, just maybe, you're not as alone as you thought. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of birdsong outside my window. The world felt strangely lighter, as if the rain from the night before had rinsed away more than just dust from the leaves. It had softened something inside me too, something that had been dormant for far too long. I brewed my coffee and stood by the window, gazing out at the garden. The single rose he'd left was still in the vase on my table, its petals opening wider, almost glowing in the morning light. I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the rose itself that mattered. It was the thought behind it. The quiet, wordless gesture that seemed to speak directly to something in my heart. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of damp earth and sun-warmed wood. My shoes made soft imprints in the soil as I walked to check on the plants. The garden seemed more alive than usual, as if it had sensed the energy between us. I turned the hose on low and began watering near the fence. I didn't have to wait long. "Morning, Mrs. Lane," came his familiar voice from the other side. I turned, trying to hide the smile tugging at my lips. "Good morning, Michael. You're up early again." "Couldn't let your garden get ahead of mine," he said with a grin. I laughed softly. "Then you've got some catching up to do." He leaned against the fence, his expression softer than usual. "Did you get caught in the rain last night?" "Just for a minute," I said. "It was beautiful, though. Peaceful." He nodded. "I was out here, too. I saw you on the porch. You looked—" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You looked happy." The words touched something deep inside me. Happy. It wasn't a word I'd heard directed toward me in a long time. Not in that way. "Well," I said after a pause, "maybe I was." He chuckled quietly. "That's good. You deserve to be." For a few seconds, we just stood there, listening to the sound of the water trickling over the soil. The moment was comfortable, natural, and yet it hummed with something beneath the surface, a quiet, almost invisible current that neither of us dared to name. I turned the hose toward the roses, focusing on the delicate petals. "You left something by the fence last night," I said, pretending to sound casual. "Did I?" "A single rose." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking sheepish. "I wasn't sure if I should. I thought maybe it was too much." "It wasn't," I said softly. "It was kind." He looked relieved. "I just wanted to thank you for the lemonade, for the company. I don't talk to many people like that. Most of my friends, well, they don't really listen." I smiled. Listening's underrated these days. He nodded slowly. "You make it feel easy." Something about the sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I looked away, pretending to inspect the flower bed. But inside, I could feel that gentle warmth blooming again, the same one I'd felt when he tucked that strand of hair behind my ear. After a while, I invited him over properly. "You might as well come through the gate instead of leaning on that fence all day," I said, gesturing toward the small side entrance. He smiled and stepped through, wiping his hands on his shorts as if he were entering sacred ground. "You have a beautiful yard," he said, glancing around. "It's like something out of a storybook." "It's my sanctuary," I said simply. "Every plant here means something to me." We walked together among the flowers, and I showed him the small section of herbs near the back corner, where rosemary and mint grew in thick clusters. He knelt down to examine them, gently brushing his fingers through the leaves. The scent filled the air instantly. "Smells like summer," he said quietly. "That's what I was going for." He looked up at me, and our eyes met again. There was no awkwardness this time, just a silent understanding. Something passed between us in that moment that neither of us needed to explain. Later, as we sat on the patio sipping lemonade, the sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the table. The world felt hushed, intimate. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every small detail, the sound of a distant lawnmower, the clink of ice in the glass, the faint trace of laughter hiding in your own breath. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "Depends on how personal," I replied with a teasing smile. He hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you ever get lonely?" The question hit deeper than I expected. I looked down at my hands, tracing the rim of the glass with my finger. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I think loneliness isn't just about being alone. It's about not being seen." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I get that." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You know you have this calm about you. Like being around you makes everything feel slower, lighter." I felt my throat tighten, emotions rising somewhere between gratitude and vulnerability. Maybe that's what happens when you stop rushing through life. You start noticing what's already there. He smiled softly. "I think that's what I've been missing." The air between us felt still, too still. I could feel the pulse of my own heartbeat in that silence. He reached across the table, just slightly, his fingers brushing against the back of my hand. Not a grab, not even a hold, just the lightest touch, the kind that says everything words can't. I didn't move away. For a moment, it was just that, quiet connection, a shared space between generations, between past and present. There was no rush, no urgency, just understanding. When he finally withdrew his hand, he exhaled slowly, almost as if he'd been holding his breath. "I should probably get going," he said quietly. "My dad's waiting for me." "Of course," I said, trying to steady my voice. "Thank you for helping with the garden." He smiled. "Anytime. I mean it." As he walked back through the gate, I watched him go, the light shifting across his shoulders, the faint scent of rosemary still hanging in the air. I stood there long after he was gone, my heart full of something I couldn't quite define. It wasn't infatuation. It wasn't longing. It was something quieter, deeper, like rediscovering a forgotten piece of myself through someone else's eyes. That night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the cicadas buzzing softly in the distance, I thought about that moment, his question, his touch, the rose. And I realized something. Connection doesn't care about time, or age, or circumstance. It finds you when you least expect it, like sunlight breaking through after days of rain. And once it does, you can't help but notice how alive the world suddenly feels again. The next few days passed quietly, though the air around me carried a different kind of stillness, the kind that follows something meaningful, something unspoken. I kept to my routine, watering the plants in the morning, brewing coffee, reading on the porch. But every sound, every movement in the yard next door seemed to pull at my attention. I found myself listening for the familiar hum of Michael's tools, the sound of his voice, or the crunch of his boots on the gravel. By the fourth morning, I hadn't seen him. The space between our houses felt unusually empty. I told myself not to think much of it, but I caught myself glancing toward the fence more times than I could count. When you get used to another person's presence, even in brief, passing moments, their absence echoes louder than you expect. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally saw him. He was in the driveway with his truck, loading a few boxes. My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought he might be leaving for good. I walked over, trying to sound casual. "Going somewhere." He turned surprised, then smiled, a tired, faint smile. "Hey, Mrs. Lane." "Yeah, just heading out to visit my uncle for a few days. He's got some land up north, needs help fixing a shed." "Oh," I said, masking the flicker of disappointment that rose inside me. "That sounds nice. Good change of scenery." He nodded. "Yeah, I'll be back in a week, though. Don't worry, I'm not abandoning your garden." The warmth in his tone made me smile despite myself. "Well, I'll try to keep things alive until then," I said. He paused, closing the truck's tailgate. "You'll do better than that. You always do." Something in the way he said it made my throat tighten again. It wasn't just about the plants, and we both knew it. He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. The late afternoon sun hit his face, outlining him in a soft, amber glow. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. The air between us carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass and something else, that quiet awareness that words couldn't quite reach. Finally, he said, "I wanted to thank you for everything." "You've already thanked me," I replied gently. "More than once." He shook his head. "Not for what you think. I mean, for reminding me that people can still be kind. Real. You listen in a way that makes the world slow down. I didn't realize how much I needed that." The honesty in his voice was disarming. I felt the weight of his words settle deep in me, not as flattery, but as something true. "You gave me something too, Michael," I said quietly. "You reminded me that there's still life left to feel, that it's okay to let someone in, even if it's just for a moment." His eyes softened, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the world around us faded, the noise, the years, the spaces that separated us. All that remained was understanding. He smiled, then looked down, as if collecting his thoughts. "When I get back," he said, "maybe we can finish fixing that trellis. And maybe you'll tell me more about your husband. I'd like to know the man who made you smile the way you do when you talk about him." That caught me off guard, not the suggestion, but the respect in his tone. The gentleness. He didn't want to replace anything. He just wanted to understand. "I'd like that," I said, my voice soft but steady. He nodded, then started toward the truck. But just before climbing in, he turned back one last time. "Take care of the garden for me?" I smiled. "Always." When he drove off, the sound of the engine faded slowly down the street until only silence remained. I stood there for a while, watching the dust settle, feeling the sun warm against my skin. Then I turned toward the house and walked back to the garden. The evening light was rich and golden, pouring through the branches like honey. I picked up the hose and began watering the plants again, just as I had on the first day. The water shimmered in the sunlight, tiny rainbows appearing in the mist. Everything felt familiar, and yet everything had changed. As I moved along the flower beds, I noticed a small pot sitting by the fence. It wasn't mine. Inside was a young sapling, freshly planted, its tag still attached. I bent down to read it. Magnolia, a symbol of endurance and renewal. My breath caught. He must have left it there before leaving. A gift, silent but full of meaning. I placed it carefully by the porch, already knowing exactly where I would plant it. Maybe near the roses, where the soil was softest and the light stayed gentle all day. That night, as the stars began to appear, I sat outside on the porch swing, the garden glowing softly in the moonlight. The magnolia sapling stood near the fence, its small leaves trembling in the breeze. I thought of him, of our quiet conversations, the rose, the laughter, the moments that reminded me that even at 50, life still had surprises to offer. Connection doesn't always have to lead to something grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's enough that it exists at all, that two people, for a brief moment in time, see each other clearly. The next morning, I planted the magnolia tree in its new spot, pressing the soil gently around its base. And as I watered it, I realized something simple but profound. Healing doesn't always come from the past. Sometimes it finds you in the present, in kindness, in small gestures, in unexpected company. As the sun climbed higher, I looked up at the fence and smiled. The world was still full of quiet miracles, waiting to be noticed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to notice them all.